Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third edition of the third episode of the SiGMA podcast, where today myself, Trevor De Giorgio, will be meeting and discussing the gaming sector, together with Ince, the Chief of Staff and Chief Compliance Officer for Playtech. Good afternoon and welcome, Ian.
Good afternoon, Trevor. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm living the dream. Thank you.
You're always living the dream.
I'm always living the dream. You're
Just
right.
as a bit of a background for everyone, me and Ian have known each other now for a good, 12, 13 years?
Yeah, of
So
that
many
order.
years.
It's definitely well into double figures.
Well into double figures.
We should both be retiring, let's put it that way.
Well, it's been a good ride till now. It's been a good ride till now. And it's been a long ride for yourself as well, Ian. I remember your days at Sporting Bet. You did some days as a consultant, and now, well, you have grown into this role at Playtech, and it's a very heavy role that you have on board. How did you get into the industry, first of all?
Wow, this going back years. So yeah, thanks, Trevor. We're talking 2008, I think it was, roughly speaking. I was working for Deloitte Consulting. I was in program leadership doing business change style work. And I remember it clearly because I was approached by a headhunter. You know, people regularly get these calls, random calls from people recruiting. And I was in a hotel in Taunton doing a quite tedious job for Deloitte. So I took the call and explored it, and it was for a company called Sporting Bet, who in those days I knew nothing about gambling. I wish I had, by the way. If I'd joined online gambling pre-UAGA in 2000, that would be fantastic. But foolishly, I went and did a master's and joined Deloitte instead. Never mind. Got there eventually, I think. So I basically was recruited by a headhunter to go and do business change in Sporting Bet, nothing to do with compliance. It was all around business process, operations, how Sporting Bet were operating between the business and the IT functions. So that's how I started on the sort of gambling world, or online gambling world, 2008. And that developed. I did that for a year, give or take. And I enjoyed my time at Sporting Bet hugely. I worked closely with a guy called Jim Wilkinson, who many of these people who listen to this podcast probably know and love. Absolute gentleman. I ended up working for him, although he was CFO, and regulations hit again. I think it was 2000. It was 2010. France hit, something like that. I think off the top of my head.
France, they started shutting down. No, before that.
Was it 2009?
France was before, because I remember I was at the MGA at the time. At the time it was the LGA, and I was on EU affairs, and I had to draft. I was responsible for drafting part of the reasoned opinion, which Malta submitted to counter the French legislation. At the time
that worked, didn't it?
we were playing this game. Now you see what Malta did last week with Bill 55.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah.
If I can interrupt you, we just mentioned.
You always do, Trevor.
I do. I know it's a habit. I just mentioned Bill 55. I think you're familiar with that, what Malta has done last week, the change in law in order to protect its licensees. Did you have a look at that?
I'm not in the weeds these days. I must confess, these days, lucky or unlucky, it's always, certainly when I started and when Trevor and I started bouncing off each other, I was definitely in the weeds and knew everything. I can tell you about Common Media in Germany. I can tell you about Plantanica and
Gambelli, even the likes.
Gambelli and Plantanica, and of course the Ince case in Germany, which always is amusing for me. But these days, I've learned I'm not clever enough, so I surround myself by more clever people, more intelligent people who work harder than I do. Tip from the top there: surround yourself with smart people who work hard. So they're in the weeds. So I'm not. I know what Malta are up to at a very high level, but I'm not in the weeds of it. But certainly I know the winds of change, and a lot of regulators, whether it's Malta or Curacao, are taking a slightly different approach to regulation, which some would say is more than welcome and potentially should have happened a while ago.
Okay, okay. I'll get back to the subject of Malta after we carry on going through your career. But you were at Sporting Bet. Then I believe there were some changes at Sporting Bet. And
Yeah,
how did
yeah,
you
Kenny.
find
Yeah,
yourself
I
at
mean,
Playtech?
Kenny took over Sporting Bet and made me redundant. Cheers, Kenny. Um, so I think he'll be phoning me from Entain shortly, though, so it's all good. So basically, I did some consulting on the side. I was between jobs for 5 months, which was great fun. Again, great timing because it was summer, so it's fantastic. And where did I? It was Steve Schreier's fault. Many of you again remember Steve Schreier, used to be in the industry of head of sales at Playtech. I sat next to him at WGES in Barcelona.
I was about to say this all went down at WGES because
Yeah,
I had a front row
Barcelona.
seat to see it all happen.
Oh, I always used to sit at the back so I could sneak out without anyone noticing. But I sat next to Steve Schreier and he asked me what I was up to. So of course I bigged myself up a little. I started consulting, got some gigs, working for myself. And he said, "Oh, Playtech's looking for a compliance officer." I'm like, you found someone 6 months ago. He said, "Not working out. How do you fancy the gig?" I said, "Yeah, always interested to talk." So ping my CV over, and then David McLeish again. Many of people know and love David quite rightly. He literally phoned me that evening, I think it was, or the following evening. David, confession time. I was drunk in a bar, so when you asked me to meet you at 7:30 the next morning, I lied and said I had a meeting already. I didn't. I was in bed with a hangover. Sorry about that, David. Anyway, we met the following week in Camden, and the rest, as they say, is history. And that was October 2013. In fact, I know it was October 2013 because it was EIG.
Okay.
Back in Barcelona.
Barcelona, I believe. EIG.
Back in the days.
You have a bit of a connection with Barcelona.
And amusingly, I was moderating a panel. I was out there on my own dollar. So I promised to moderate a panel for someone out there. So I told Playtech, I said, "Look, I'll be at the EIG anyway. You just pay my expenses and life will go on. And that'll be my first day at work." Okay. And I sat on a panel with Francesco Rodano, again, known and loved to all of us.
And who you actually recruited then?
Well, yeah, more recruited him after the event. And ironically, sorry, Francesco, he now works for me under the Playtech Protect banner. But as Italian regulator back then, he sort of had a right pop at suppliers supporting operators in illegal markets on the day.
I remember that. I remember then Francesco
had actually. I sat there and he was like straining and chops and going.
He had the balls to then write to some of the actual IP holders like Marvel. I'm trying to forget some of the others, but he wrote to them if I'm not mistaken.
Because I remember, being at ICE when I was at Sporting Bet, I was again on another panel and someone asked me and said, "Look, if you were in charge or you were a regulator, how would you stop illegal operators?" And 4 things. You start with the IP, but that's noise, isn't it? An operator takes 36 seconds to change an IP. Then you follow the money.
Okay.
Again, that's limited. And then you go for the suppliers.
Yep. And you go to the suppliers, and then you go after who is actually giving content to the suppliers, which would be.
It's 2 sorts of suppliers, aren't there? There's the actual software suppliers, and then there's the associated businesses such as marketing affiliates, yada yada yada. Now, if you combine all 4 of those in a robust manner, then you've got a fighting chance of restricting illegal operators. Francesco played that back on day one when I took over my title wasn't as grand then, but it was still head of compliance for Playtech. And he did it publicly and said, why don't software suppliers such as Playtech stop supplying illegal operators? Anyway, long story short, I did. So we're friends now.
Yes, I remember that was. But when you then look at the numbers in Italy and you look at the actual channeling rate, which is pretty high in Italy, and then it's pretty high. I mean, it's well above the 85%. And then you compare it with some of these other jurisdictions who have opened up and who haven't done the same thing. You get to see the difference between how regulators, then being a pragmatic regulator, gives you certain results, as opposed to just take a hardline approach and don't really get anywhere, unfortunately.
I think you're right there. It's the word pragmatism, isn't it? it's and not learning from each other. I don't know your opinion. Well, I can guess it's probably we generally think alike. Learn from others. Don't take an
Yes.
arrogant approach.
Last week,
Actually,
Ian, I had Juan Espinosa.
yeah.
So yes, and that's the way he spoke. And look at this. I mean, Spain was one of the few countries which actually lowered its taxation rate.
Yeah, and I mean, Spain was a cracker. I mean, that was where I cut my teeth, to be honest, on compliance and regulation, because that was when I got the gig with Sporting Bet to look at regulation, and we had Spain, Denmark, Greece, didn't we? All at the same time, and both Spain and Denmark were going to go live on 1st of January or midnight. 1st of Jan 2011, I think it was off the top of my head. Denmark went live then. Spain delayed by 6 months, but only made the decision on like the 28th of December, which was a nightmare for the industry. But, and that was because the Spanish regulators, Juan Carlos Alfonso, wasn't it, back in the day?
Mm-hmm.
And he was pretty apolitical, and he really drove it through. And he was a pragmatist, and he wanted to get it done. He wasn't a political animal, which is telling.
And listen, when you have regulators who are actually non-political animals, you actually get some very, very good results. I mean, you also mentioned the Danish market. The Danish market has some pretty solid numbers. So remember, Birgit did quite a strong job over there in the opening of the market, and she promoted that market really heavily.
I mean, we always quote the Danish model as a strong model, don't we? Because it's done in a very pragmatic manner. Mm-hmm. They enforce it, but they enforce it behind closed doors. Although they've been a bit more vocal more recently. And they haven't interfered too much, have they? They restricted the amount of licenses. I think they originally awarded, was it 55, 57 on day one?
It wasn't like some other jurisdictions which can't.
Yeah, I mean, even the UK, you've got over 300 or 250, 300 online licensed operators. Now, if you look at the marketplace and look at the tier ones and the tier twos, they're, 100 is about the right number, isn't it? Give or take, for a European marketplace of grown-up operators, shall we say. So, as soon as anyone starts dishing out 1,000 licenses or 500 licenses, you've got to question the veracity of some of the applications. A bit harsh, but...
You mentioned, I think we tend to agree on that one as well. You mentioned the UK. When you look at the UK and the way the market is regulated over there, without wanting to cause any problems here, but sometimes don't you see that it's a bit of shoot first and ask questions later?
Yeah, I mean, the UK regulations, as they stand, are pretty sensible bunch of regulations. The concerns that have happened over more recently, less so when Jenny Williams was in charge, and you could argue that she was a bit soft on the industry, quite happily. And then was it Sarah Gardner came in and made it more consumer focused, because that was her background and the intent, which is nothing wrong with that. But then it almost became almost a mission to really clamp down. It felt like people were out to get the industry rather than work hand in hand. And another regulator, I've been through numerous audits, too many to mention. And one auditor from another regulator said, look, our job as a regulator is when the analogy they use is when you park your car and the wheels, you're in the parking space, but your wheels on the yellow line, we'll tell you and give an opportunity for you to move your car so the wheel's off the yellow line and 100% in the parking space.
Yeah.
Other regulators will see your wheel on the yellow line and immediately slap a parking ticket on you. And the UK is a tricky one because obviously it's a saturated market. There are lots of licensees there. It's a key market for many operators. And you've got a regulator that has taken, I think the winds of change are coming or have come, but certainly historically took a very aggressive approach to enforcement. And a lot of the cases we still hear about are historic, i.e. the incident happened in 2017, 2018.
Pre-2021.
Oh, for sure. for sure, very much so. So whilst there some of the positions are indefensible, and you hear about them and you think to yourself, honestly, they did that, and it's absolutely mad. Others are, well, actually, that happened 4 years ago. The emphasis coming both from the regulator and the industry was slightly different. And the industry has moved on a huge amount, particularly in the UK, globally, in its responsibility to the consumers and the focus on responsible gambling and putting the consumer and their safety first. But then we still sort of get beaten up pre-2021. And particularly the UK, it's outcomes based, and interpretation is key.
Do you think that the changes which well, we've been hearing about these changes for quite some time now, but will these changes result in a different form of regulation, or a different form or different manner in which the UK will regulate the market? At least we're already seeing some of that.
I hope so. But there's still a dichotomy, because on one hand you've got, was it 2020 guidance on RG or interactions, and you've got Andrew Rhodes saying, well, actually, we never told you to do affordability checks or to check bank statements. That was never in the guidance. And yet you've got numerous members of the industry who know very well that they were called to account or challenged by the UKGC about affordability and how they prove it and where the statement. I've been on interaction, where there's a phone call about how we measure interactions, and they, please show me your top 20 customers, and I remember one clearly. They had a huge win, right? Prove they had a huge win. Where did their money come from? Show me their bank statements. How can they afford it? I want to see bank statements. I want to P60. I want to see that winning scratch card they claim to have had. That's slightly different from what they're saying they asked for and what they didn't. So either someone's either being, the information is not going to the higher echelons of the UKGC, or they're rowing back very quickly. Going forward, will the white paper affect that? I think it's more to do with leadership in the UKGC than.
In what sense, Ian, you mean by leadership in the UKGC?
Well, again, it's it's what you tell your enforcement teams or your compliance teams on the ground. So if I'm a regulator and the regulations have some interpretation, as all do, because they're, find me a regulation without some level of interpretation. It's how you interpret it and how you enforce it. And do you take an aggressive approach, or do you take a more collegiate approach? And do you give the benefit of doubt to the operators and say, well, actually, there are certain concerns of this account in 2017, but we can see since 2017 you've taken these measures, boom, 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 absolutely. So look, we're not going to start an investigation dating back to 2017 on something around source of funds, although they call it AML, but it's source of funds, isn't it? Because it's not in the interest of the regulator, it's not in the interest of the operator, because you move forward, your whole staff have changed, the ownership have changed, for example. Why go back to 2017 and open a can of worms when you can clearly see there being significant step changes? And I'm not saying if there's a horrific incident, I'm not saying if there was a fraud committed in 2017. However, if, for example, you allowed someone who had large winnings to redeposit those winnings, and you didn't do a secondary source of funds check to the level of detail, or you had an interaction but it wasn't branded a RG interaction,
yeah.
When do you let it go, or when do you go at it? Back in 2017, for that reason, exactly, pragmatism and collaboration. We hear a lot about regulators collaborating, but do they? Yes, they go to Graph and have a chat to each other, and they make grand statements about sharing information globally. But ultimately, the regulators, I believe, a lot of them should work a lot more collaboratively with the industry. And it doesn't always happen. Some do, some don't. I've always said it, you've been in the room, I've said it, is trust the industry. Yes, it's easy to go, the industry is awful. the industry's taking advantage of the consumers, the advertising is awful, etc., etc. But life has moved on. Trust. If you stand there with your arms folded, going, "I'm not going to trust you," you don't expect the other person to reciprocate either, do you?
The key word is balance. How do you maintain a balance between
A healthy balance, a constructive balance, and within that balance, you can always have challenge. Again, I've known you for many years. We've always, we are different characters. I'm a cheeky bugger, and you know it. And I always take the Michael out of you, and you respond robustly. But neither of us take it personally. We know it's to and fro, and it's either banter or even vigorous or aggressive disagreement with each other over certain points. But that's fine. You can still be friends. You can agree to differ, or you can agree to respect the other person's opinion. And we've always found the middle ground between us. We've never come to blows. Still time.
And how? No, we've never. But how important is it in the operations for a regulator to keep a balance where it does not become overbearing on its licensees and makes its licensees low-hanging fruit? And like that, opening the door to the black market. Well, the door is always open. The black market will always be there, unfortunately.
Yeah, of course.
But if you don't maintain that balance, the door is just going to open more and more and more. How much damage can that cause?
Oh, huge. I mean, it's very easy to see. I guess, and fundamentally, if we go back to first principles, the market is regulated for a reason. So gambling is a legitimate regulated activity that the residents, the domiciles of that country can take part in. That's the start point, isn't it? So anyone who is licensed by the regulator should have a sort of a natural benefit of the doubt that they're carrying out a legitimate industry in a legitimate manner. Now, if you start doing a compliance review with the thought in your mind that actually a operator is doing something wrong in the first instance, it's how you approach it. If you approach it that the industry is bad and taking advantage of vulnerable people, and that is your thinking, your start point, and as we've seen, and is quite common, we always talk about the prevalence rates and the 0.7, 0.4, 0.2, whatever the day of the week it is for prevalence studies, that the people are really badly harmed. But no one ever starts with a start point that 99.1, or even roll it down, 98% of the gambling population enjoy it. It's healthy, it's stress relief, it's fun, it gives them some sort of enjoyment in their life. That's not the start point ever, is it? The start point is always there's harm, and it works back from there. So if I was a regulator, first thing I do is, one, fully understand the industry and engage with them. I'd spend time with them. I'd learn their business. I'd make sure I fully understood it. I put myself, and I do this the reverse. When we're dealing with regulators and dealing with even licensees as a B2B, I tell my team, put yourself in their shoes. What's going to go wrong? What would happen if you're the regulator? What are you looking for? What concerns you? And you flip it on its head. If I'm a regulator, I'd flip it on the other side of the head. So I'm going to do a compliance evaluation of Trevor's team, TrevBet. Let's look at 98% of the gambling population in TrevBet are probably legitimate gamblers. I know the industry, so I know TrevBet works with high net worth individuals predominantly. So you're going to have 80 to 90% of your population are going to be high rollers, and then you're going to have regular gamblers. So that's how I start my thinking when I go through the door of TrevBet. I don't think, well, actually, everyone who gambles with TrevBet is being taken advantage of. They can't afford to gamble properly. They're on their uppers because they spent all their money gambling, and they're on the verge of, destitution. So it's the way you think, and it's understanding the industry. And the converse is the industry is understanding the regulator has got a job to do. They don't always make popular decisions. They are an instrument of government and default instrument of politics as a result thereof. Their hands are tied to a certain extent. So let's meet in the middle, and yes, we'll agree to disagree, and we can have vigorous debates about, 3.4.1 of the LCCP and the interpretation thereof, but do it in a sensible manner. And when the industry, rather than trying to take advantage of loopholes, for example, perhaps points them out and says, look, okay, there's a balance to be struck.
Okay. We have just a few minutes left.
There's a reason I'm not a regulator as well.
We have a few minutes left. And you spoke about teamwork, working together. I know in your background, you've worked a lot on a team level. How important to you is working as a team? And how do you keep that team spirit, especially as you get more C's in front of your name, and you get more people who you're responsible for?
There's a word beginning with C. Many people describe me using. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Yes, teamwork is huge. No one can do everything by themselves. It's impossible. We know that. And I think as you grow as an individual and you get more senior, you've got to realize that you can't do it. And many of us miss that. Many of us miss getting our hands dirty and being in the trenches and, knowing the absolute detail. And it's difficult to leave it behind. But as I said at the beginning, the key thing for me is, one, building a good team, intelligent, hardworking people, but again, make it a fun environment, as fun as you can make it, and learn to delegate. Trust those below you. Don't hang on. Don't think you know best. Don't be arrogant. There's a reason we pay salaries to high-performing, intelligent individuals, not to override them, not to tell them how to do their job, but to enable them and give them the boundaries and the knowledge and the tools to utilize their intelligence, their hard work to the best of their abilities. That's sort of my starting point. Now, how do you keep a team fresh and working well together? That's tough. I think you've got to recognize that realistically, all teams have a life cycle. Everyone can leave a business, and everyone after a while gets tired of their role they're in and the work they're doing to an extent. And I've had it in Playtech. We started with when I joined a predominantly Israeli team that morphed into, through circumstance and recruitment, to a London team where we had a very high performing team. Now I've stepped away from my new role. I've stepped away from it more. I still hold the title, but the day-to-day operations I delegate down. And we've had a huge change. People have been moved onwards and upwards. And I think recognizing that people will move, it's not an insult if they decide to quit. I regard it as a feather in my cap that if I look back and see my team members, I'm not going to embarrass people by mentioning their names directly, but probably all of them have gone on to be heads of, heads of Betson. They've gone to Flutter. They've got to Entain. They almost, to a person, have gone to a very, not a very, very senior position, but why not? But a very senior position, a head of, to run a compliance team in their own right. To me, that's the biggest pat on the head. It's one, we do a good job in Playtech, no doubts, and I'm happy to go toe to toe with my team or the compliance team, say we're probably one of the best in the industry. We can argue, if some buts and around the houses, but we're up there, 100%. But I'm even more proud of the fact that I look at the guys and girls in equal measure, in fact, more lasses, I think, they've gone on all to be heads off. You see them in the industry, in senior positions, see them on panels, leaving me behind. Fair play. That's brilliant. And if you do that and you feel it, people know. There's a common word now. People say authentic. You've got to be authentic on TikTok or whatever. But when you are genuine and people know that you're looking after your team and you're enabling them, and you don't have to be nice. It's not about being nice. And this is a classic. I'll leave you with this one. Leadership is not a popularity game.
No, it isn't.
It's tough being a boss. You can't be people's friends. It's nice if you become their friends, absolutely, but you shouldn't go out currying friendship.
There's a line which you can't cross.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to be strong. You've got to be tough love. But people recognize, we're humans. We recognize when someone is batting for your side and looking after you genuinely within bounds. And if you do that, and you put them first, not yourself, put them first because they're the most important people, not you, them. People know that and respond well.
Ian, it was a pleasure having you. Hope we meet up soon.
Yeah, it's about time we had a beer.
Yeah, or a glass
Sorry,
of
I'm
wine.
not encouraging drinking because drinking's bad.
Thank you so much. And we'll be back with another episode next week. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, Trevor. Take care.